Okay, welcome to the lecture on choice in a world of scarcity, which is the topic of chapter 2. Here we're going to talk about how individuals make choices based on their budget constraint. We'll take a look at the production possibility frontier and social choices, which will be really our first model of the course. And we'll discuss a little bit about confronting some of the objections to the economic approach. So anyway, in general, you could argue that the higher the degree, the higher the salary, right? But why aren't more people pursuing higher degrees, you might ask? Well, there's a short answer. And that short answer is that there are choices and there are trade-offs. And of course, there are opportunity costs as well. That is, high school graduates are beginning to realize that there may be greener pasture elsewhere other than obtaining a college degree. In other words, that the cost of obtaining a college degree, not so much just in the dollars and cents of forking over money to acquire it, is expensive. I think everyone clearly sees that. But the opportunity cost in terms of what you're giving up has certainly become a lot higher, especially during a booming and an expanding economy like the one we're experiencing at the moment. So let's take a look at how individuals make choices. We have two things: the budget constraint. The budget constraint is simply all the possible consumption combinations of goods that somebody can afford, given the prices of the goods when all the income is spent, and the boundary of that opportunity set. The opportunity set is simply all those possible combinations of consumption that somebody can afford, given the price of all those goods and the individual's incomes. All right. So let's take a look at a simple model. Here we have burgers and bus tickets, and we have a person with an income of just $10. And burgers are $2 and bus tickets are 50 cents. So how do we come up with these arrangements here, these intersection points? Well, you just take $10 and divide it by $2, and that's how you get that 5 for burgers. That's the maximum amount of burgers that you could buy with all your money. Of course, it would mean no money for bus tickets. It's zero. And if you took all of the $10 and bought 50-cent bus tickets, well, you could get 20 rides that way. So that's the reason why we have that 20. And so the line represents all income spent and all the other combinations that this person could have engaged in. All right. So B, for example, represents 4 burgers and 4 bus tickets. And a D, for example, represents 2 burgers and 12 bus tickets. If you want to work out the math on that, just take $2 times $2 times 2 burgers, that's $4. You've still got $6 left over, and $6 with 50 cents for a bus ticket could give you 12 bus tickets. And so that's how we got both of those numbers. All right. Now your opportunity cost indicates what someone has to give up in order to obtain what he or she has. In other words, the cost of one item is really just the lost opportunity to do or consume something else. And the opportunity cost essentially is really just the value of your next best available alternative. It doesn't always have to be dollars and cents. So in other words, if you went to the movies, what else could you have done with your time? Not necessarily your money, but with your time. Well, you could have gone for a leisurely walk, or you could have taken in a baseball game, or you could have spent a relaxing evening at home. But whichever one of those alternatives was the highest valued alternative, that would actually be your opportunity cost of engaging in that particular choice, all right, or making that particular choice. So in many cases, you could argue that it's reasonable to refer to the opportunity cost really as the price. So for example, if your cousin buys a new bicycle for $300, you would say that $300 really represents the amount of other consumption that he's forsaken. So that's not really inappropriate. But sometimes the price, as measured in dollars, may not accurately capture true opportunity costs when it's just time that's involved. So attending college, for example, the out-of-pocket cost of attending college includes tuition, the books, the room, and the board, and the other expenses. That's true. But additionally, during the hours you're attending class and studying, it's impossible to really work at a paying job, right? Certainly true that you can work part-time, but if you're attending full-time, taking 15 or 18 hours, even a part-time job might be next to impossible. or you're severely limiting, let's say, your income opportunities. So college imposes both an out-of-pocket cost and an opportunity cost in terms of lost earnings. So you might be thinking of all sorts of opportunity costs: buying versus leasing a car, investing in different ways, that is, whether to put your money in a savings account or a certificate of a deposit or a mutual fund or a stock, or going out to eat versus preparing food at home, or walking or taking public transportation. We're faced with choices all the time. And sometimes these aren't really choices that may appear to be economical to us. In other words, they may not appear to be ostensibly economic decisions, but they are. Anytime we're making a choice, we're giving up something else, and that's a cost, right? So what economists do is use an analysis referred to as marginal analysis. And we're not saying that other people don't use this either, they just may not give it a name. But it's essentially examining the benefits and the costs of choosing a little bit more or a little less of a good. So the utility that you get, that is the satisfaction or the usefulness or value that you obtain from something, consuming a good or a service, that's what we mean when economists use the phrase utility. And when we discuss this notion of the law of diminishing marginal utility, all we're saying is that as a person receives more and more of a good, the additional marginal utility from each additional unit of the good is going to decline. For example, the first slice of pizza eaten is going to bring certainly a whole heck of a lot more satisfaction than that sixth one. It's not, you're not going to get any satisfaction from the sixth, but it's clearly going to be diminishing. And certain goods tend to diminish much more quickly in terms of the marginal utility than others. So for example, if you've ever bought a newspaper from a mechanical newspaper vending machine, you'll notice when you put the coins in and you open up the door, that all the newspapers are sitting there, and you could grab another one, but it turns out most people don't. For the simple reason, not just because people are honest, I mean, that's probably the biggest reason why, but even people who are dishonest might not take the second newspaper simply because it has zero marginal utility at that point. Not just less, zero. I mean, what are you going to do with it? It has the same news as the first one, unless what you're trying to do is clip coupons, but I think you get the main point. So another notion of costs for economists, and this is something that sometimes lay people don't really get a firm grasp on, is this notion of sunk costs. Now, what is that? Those are costs that are incurred in the past and they can't be recovered. So for people and firms alike, dealing with sunk costs can be kind of frustrating. So for example, a firm finds it hard to give up on a new product that's doing poorly because much money was spent in creating and launching the product. And sometimes managers and executives get emotionally attached to the decisions that they've made. That's a deadly mistake, and it can really get you into big trouble. And so it's important to not be too emotionally attached to those kinds of decisions, but that's what happens. So the lesson of sunk costs is to ignore these past errors, make decisions on what will happen in the future. Don't look back. So let's take a look at our first model, the production possibility frontier. Well, this is simply a diagram. It shows the productively efficient combination of two products that an economy can produce given the resources that it has available to it. And the slope of the production possibility frontier shows the opportunity cost on that frontier. So let's take a look. Here we've got healthcare on the vertical axis, and we have education on the horizontal axis. And so, obviously this is a very simplified economy here, and a kind of a boring economy because these are the only two goods. But if we're at A, we have a lot of healthcare, but we've got no education. If we're at F, we've got a lot of education, but we've got no healthcare. And so all these other choices, B, C, and D, all represent different amounts of combinations of the two. So if you're all the way over here at B and you want to get to C, that is, you want to get a little bit more education, well, the opportunity cost of that is the amount of healthcare, good healthcare that you'll have to give up, given by this little vertical distance here, right, along it, that we didn't draw out exactly, but if you take your mouse pointer and you bring it on over here, it would be this vertical distance right here. And so That's what we mean when we refer to an opportunity cost. And sometimes the opportunity cost can be quite steep. So in other words, getting a little bit more education here at the end costs us a lot in terms of healthcare that's been foregone. So a society could choose really to produce at any combination of healthcare and education along that production possibility frontier. It doesn't have enough resources, unfortunately, to produce outside the frontier. So these points out here really just are not possible given the current state of technology and given the current resources that we have available to us. So because the PPF is downward sloping from the left to the right, the only way society can really obtain more education is by giving up more of that healthcare. Now, another concept that's going to come up over and over again in the course is this notion of the law of diminishing returns. And what that's referring to is the additional increments of resources to producing a good or service that are added. The marginal benefit from those additional increments tend to decline. So the law of diminishing marginal utility is a more specific case of the law of diminishing returns. So you don't want to confuse those, although they're very much related in some ways. The law of diminishing returns generally refers to productivity, whereas the law of diminishing marginal utility is more on the consumer side. This curvature of the PPF often throws students for a loop because they sometimes wonder, why isn't it linear? Well, it shows that as we add more resources to education, moving from the left to the right along that horizontal axis, the original gains are fairly large, but they gradually diminish. And by contrast, as we add a lot more resources to healthcare, moving from the bottom to the top on the vertical axis, the original gains are fairly large, but gradually diminish. And the reason for that is that opportunity costs, typically we don't face constant cost. Most economic phenomena that we see in the real world suffers from this increasing opportunity cost effect. And that is what has given rise to that outwardly bowed out form of the production possibility frontier. Now, the two major differences between a budget constraint and a PPF are, number one, the budget constraint is a straight line because there isn't any diminishing marginal productivity there because we're talking about income. The slope is given really by the relative prices of the two goods, right? That's it, which are fixed, so the slope doesn't change. Now, the PPF has a curve shape, like I mentioned before, because of the law of diminishing returns. So the slope is a little different at various points on the PPF. Now, the absence of specific numbers on the axis of the PPF, that kind of bugs us a little bit, but the exact amount of the resources in an imaginary economy is not really known. So that's the reason why we don't really put any numbers on them. But we could, right, if we were talking about a real economy. So let's take a look at both of these things side by side. They look very similar, but on the left you have the opportunity set, which is really like a budget constraint. And on the right, we have what's referred to as the social production possibility frontier. So both the budget constraint and the social production possibility frontier show constraints under which individual consumers and society as a whole operate. Now, both diagrams show that you have some kind of trade-off in terms of choosing more of one good at the cost of less of the other good. Now, there's two types of efficiency that we study in economics. There are other types of efficiency, but these are the two that are the most prominent. We have productive efficiency. That's when it's impossible to produce more of one good without decreasing the quantity produced of another good. In other words, any choice that's inside the PPF is typically going to be productively inefficient. Why? Because it's possible to produce more of one good, or more of the other good, or some combination of both goods. Now, allocative efficiency is a different story. This is when the mix of the goods produced represents the mix that society most desires, hence the name allocative efficiency or allocation, right? So, productive efficiency, any choice that's along the PPF, like B, C, and D, are all going to be perfectly, productively efficient. R does not, because it's inside the PPF, and the resources aren't being used. And of course, you can't be outside the PPF because if technology and resources don't allow us to get to a point like that. Now, how much of a good a country decides to produce is going to depend on how expensive it is to produce it versus buying it from a different country. So countries tend to have different opportunity costs of producing a specific good, either because of different climates, geography, technology, or skills. And economists have discovered, and they discovered this quite a long time ago, this notion of comparative advantage. That's when a country can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another country can. Now, that's very different than the notion of absolute advantage. Absolute advantage means being able to produce something using fewer inputs. But comparative advantage has to do with lower opportunity costs, right? So if we have the Brazil and the U.S. here, the U.S. PPF is a little flatter than Brazil's PPF, and that implies that the opportunity cost of wheat in terms of sugarcane is going to be a lot lower in the U.S. than Brazil. And conversely, the opportunity cost of sugarcane is lower in Brazil. So the U.S. has a comparative advantage in wheat, and Brazil is going to have a comparative advantage in sugarcane. And that's great, because that means that there's an opportunity to trade. Now, there's certainly some objectives in understanding this economic approach to decision-making. First of all, people, firms, and societies don't exactly act in a way that fits in this economic way of thinking. So I don't want you to think that economists are naive here. However, it is reasonable, at least as a first approximation, to analyze them with the tools of economic analysis, because it gives us at least some framework to think about them, even if people and firms don't behave exactly like this. And these will be addressed in a lot later chapters, especially in the micro class, which, if you take Economics 2302, microeconomics, you'll cover that. Otherwise, in macro, we don't cover consumer choice. In any event, the other objection that's often raised is that people, firms, and society shouldn't act this way. This is more of a normative statement. So the economic approach portrays people as sort of self-interested, but economics is not really a form of moral instruction, first of all. The second thing, it seeks to describe economic behavior really as it actually is, not as it should be. So we tend to use more positive statements which describe the world as it is. These are factual. We try to avoid normative statements, not that they're not important. The trouble with normative statements is we can't use science to evaluate them, because normative statements typically are describing how the world should be. And these are really subjective questions of opinion. Not that opinions are unimportant, but it is difficult to use a scientific analysis to evaluate the validity of them. So certainly people's freedom to make their own economic choices has a moral value that's worth respecting. And then lastly, I would be remiss if we didn't discuss this notion of the invisible hand, which of course was identified in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. I believe it was only mentioned one time, maybe twice, but I know not much more than that. It's a concept that individual self-interested behavior can lead to positive social outcomes. The reason why we say it's an invisible hand is because not anybody is really directing this behavior. It sort of naturally occurs by people looking out after their own interests, which is interesting because not only are their needs met, but they even meet other people's needs, even when they didn't intend to meet other people's needs. So consumers will encourage businesses to offer goods and services that meet their needs. And so it's possible that broader social good can emerge from selfish individual actions. So self-interest in economics doesn't necessarily have to imply self-interest in all aspects of life. In any event, that's the end of this lecture, and until next time.